Questions without notice. The member for Morialta.
Thank you, sir. My question is to the Premier. Who wrote the text of the letter signed by the Premier and the Minister for Education that was received last week by families of public school students across South Australia? And with leave, I will explain.
Leave is sought. Is leave granted? The member.
Sir, last week, public school families across South Australia received a letter signed by the Premier and the Minister for Education, Training and Skills on the Premier's letterhead in relation to school fees.
The Minister has the call.
Thank you, Speaker, and I thank the member for Morialta for the question. I believe, if I'm correct, the letter to which the Shadow Minister would be referring is a letter which was talking about the Malinaskis Labor government's commitment to reduce the amount that families at public schools pay for the materials and services charge by about $100 this coming financial year and next financial year. Obviously, this is a very important announcement at any time, but particularly, I think, Speaker, with the cost of living concerns that are facing South Australians at the moment, I think it is appropriate that this government has done everything in its power to bring this commitment forward so that it comes into effect in this coming financial year, so those parents get $100 off the materials and services charge for every child that they have, and then the same again for next year, Mr Speaker. In terms of who actually drafted the letter, I would have to go back and check that. I'm happy to take it on advice and come back to the House with an answer.
Member for Morialta.
Thank you, sir. My question is to the Premier. Were any public servants from the Premier's office correspondence team, or indeed any other public servants in the Premier's office, involved in either the drafting of or indeed the dissemination of the letter in question?
Premier.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm more than happy to attain a briefing regarding the specifics of who was responsible for what part of the letter as per the Minister's question, but needless to say that the government takes very serious its obligation to inform South Australians who are the beneficiaries of government policy. We know that South Australians at the moment are very much got cost of living top of mind, and this is a policy that I understand enjoys bipartisan support because, of course, the Shadow Minister announced this policy in the lead up to the election in conjunction with ourselves. So this was a policy that South Australians who were paying close attention to the election process would know enjoys bipartisan support. We've very much hoped that that bipartisan support is maintained. In terms of the policy itself, as the Minister has correctly enunciated, it is one that provides a not insignificant degree of relief to families. We've got a number of policies that were delivered in the context of the most recent state budget that try and orientate support to those members of our community that need it most. On one end, we've got the cost of living concession, which we announced before the election we were committed to doubling. That has been honoured in this year's budget and will be rolled out progressively over coming months. That is orientated towards those South Australians that are on low and fixed incomes, pensioners probably being the most significant cohort. Then on the other end of the spectrum, we've got families, Mr Speaker, and families we know when they've got school-aged children have to incur substantial costs associated with education, and we see this $100 relief providing a degree of support to those families, and they're entitled to know about that relief accordingly.
Member for Morialta.
So my question is to the Minister for Education. Who in the Minister's office was responsible for the dissemination of the letter provided to public education families, in particular to education directors across the state and in the Department for Education? And with your leave and that of the House, sir, I'd like to explain.
Leave is sought. Is leave granted? The member.
Thank you, sir. The opposition has been informed that the letter in question was sent to principals across South Australia early last week by education directors who requested that they send it on to their local communities.
The Minister.
Thank you, Speaker, and I thank the member for Morialta again for the question. And as I said in my answer to the member's first question, I'm happy to get some information and come back. But my understanding in terms of who disseminated the letter, that was done by the Education Department. So my understanding is that it would have been the Education Department who disseminated it to education directors to make sure that it got to schools. And the reason that it was so important for us to do that quickly, Mr Speaker, was because we're up against a bit of a timeline here to make sure that we got it out in time for this coming financial year to make sure that those families who were eligible for the $100 off each child for the materials and services charge knew what action they needed to take, Mr Speaker, in order to, first of all, claim it if they hadn't paid their school fees yet, and in those cases where they may have already paid their materials and services charge, what they could do to get that refunded, or in some cases, it is, I understand, possible for them to work with the school in question to have that $100 discounted off other things that aren't covered by the materials and services charge, which could be in some cases school camps or excursions.
The member for Morialta on a supplementary.
Why does the minister say that it was necessary to get that information out quickly to families so they would know what to do, when the letter itself says, and I quote, "You don't need to do anything yet or contact your school," and then goes on to explain that the school will be in touch with families to later tell them what to do?
Order. The minister. Member for Unley.
Thank you.
Order. Member for Badco.
Thank you.
Order. Premier's call to order. Member for Schubert's call to order. Member for Unley. Minister has the call. The minister.
Thank you, Speaker. Well, that's a real gotcha moment, that one. Because obviously, given that those opposite, when they were still in government, made a commitment to offer this $100 per child this financial year and the next, and it was matched by the Malinascus Labor government, then Malinascus Labor opposition, and there was some public discussion, I guess, dialogue between public school families and the Education Department around how this would be happening and when it would be happening. We want to make sure that it was clear to parents who had already started asking questions straight away about whether or not they needed to do anything to be able to claim the money, and of course whether or not where they had already paid school fees, which has happened in some cases, Mr Speaker, what action they could take to try to get reimbursed for the school fees they had already paid, or whether they could work with their local school in any cases to have that $100 instead discounted off other things that the school might be running in that year, for instance, excursions or school camps. So it was very much about informing the public, making sure they knew what they did or didn't have to do in this case, because I know as a former Education Minister himself, the member for Morialta would know, in such an enormous system where we've got more than 200 in the whole public system, 270-something thousand students, in the public system more than 170. There's obviously going to be lots of questions that we're going to have to field from concerned parents who want to make sure that they are eligible, and if they've already paid the school fees, what they can do to still take advantage of the $100. So making the most of this communication out to families about what the process was, I think, was the prudent thing to do.
The member for Morialta and then the member for King. Member for Morialta.
Thank you, sir. My question is to the Minister for Education. Why did the minister feel it was necessary for a letter to go from the minister and the Premier to all families, in addition to information they received from their schools, explaining the very things the minister outlined in his last answer about what families would need to do?
The minister.
Thank you, Speaker, and I thank the member again for the question. Well, this is a very important announcement. As I said in my last answer, Mr Speaker, the public education system in South Australia is vast. There are something like 170-something thousand students in the public education system, lots of families. Therefore, and some families, multiple children, as I said, some hadn't paid their school fees yet. The process for them in terms of materials and services charge was going to be quite straightforward. Those who had already paid the materials and services charge, the process was a little bit more complicated. I guess out of an abundance of caution, to make sure everyone was aware of this, and to make sure, of course, too, that everybody who had already paid their school fees was still able to take advantage of the $100 per child, because, as the member for Morialta stated in his question before, those who hadn't paid the school fees or the materials and services charge didn't actually need to take any action. Those who did would possibly need to discuss with the local school how to get a reimbursement, or discuss with the local school how that $100 per child could perhaps be deducted off the cost of something else. So to make sure that was understood by families, and that as many South Australian families as possible could take advantage of this fantastic cost of living initiative that we have put in place, Mr Speaker, We also sent a letter from the Premier and the Minister.
The member for King.
Mr Speaker, my question is to the Deputy Premier. Can the Deputy Premier update the House on her country cabinet visit to the Limestone Coast last week and some of the work being undertaken by local businesses to be more environmentally sustainable?
The Deputy Premier.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I'm delighted to answer this question and thank the member for her question. One of the questions that has come up for me in this new range of portfolios I have is why I have such a broad range of having industry, innovation and science on the one hand, along with defence and space industries, and also climate, environment and water. But in fact, if we go out into the world, into the community, many businesses, if not most businesses, are now already ahead of many politicians and many bureaucrats, dare I say, which is that they understand truly that the future of growing our economy, the future of being sustainable and prosperous, is to be much more mindful of the impact on the environment that our businesses have and, in fact, able to take advantage of the opportunities presented in being in a very low-carbon electricity generating state and increasingly in a sustainable and circular economy state. And that was really borne home to me on the recent visit that we had to the Limestone Coast as a cabinet. A very welcome visit, incidentally. It was a delight to be there, and a couple of the local members are sitting in this chamber. We were warmly welcomed by the community. But I spent the first day essentially looking at environment projects and the second day essentially looking at industry projects. But in fact, I spoke about and listened, more importantly, to people talking about the environment, possibly even slightly more on the second day than on the first, because it has become such an overwhelming driver for businesses to shift to a more sustainable footing. So on the first day, I visited some dairy farmers who, the Muellers, Ian and Julia, the parents, and Trent, the son. I think the third generation is coming up through. And the dairy farmers had engaged in a water efficiency program. They're sitting on the Murray, very similar to that which we are begging the other states to undertake in order to give the 450 gigalitres, but is being resisted by the other states, facilitated by the great capitulator on the other side. But they were able to sell an allocation of water and invest in efficiency projects that then facilitated being able to have that water become part of the environmental flow. And they were pleased not just to do the right thing for the sustainability of the river, but in fact to make their farm far more efficient and far more prosperous. I visited a number of friends groups in Bull Lagoon, the Mount Gambier area parks, Bull and Hacks Lagoon, and also Shorebird South East. So naturally, they talked a lot about the environment with me and the need to look after nature. But the next day, when I spent time with Mondelez, with BioGrow, with Kimberly-Clark and with Timberlink, I heard just as much about the importance of paying attention to nature. And each one of those companies is working on not only treading more lightly on the earth, but in fact to contribute and to have a prosperous path through demonstrating to their supply chain and to the people that they are marketing to that they are more environmentally sustainable. And that is the great opportunity that we have in South Australia. We have an opportunity to not only do the right thing, but in fact be secure in our trade relations, which increasingly will expect, every customer will expect low carbon, will expect sustainability, and be more efficient and therefore able to extract more value and more profit. Mondelez is shifting to a proper wastewater treatment plant. BioGrow is an incredible company that takes green waste and also forestry waste, so the detritus that's left after clearance, and turn that into compost and sell that both in Victoria and South Australia. Kimberly-Clark is looking at alternative sources of energy in order to reduce their carbon load. And Timberlink has created a product that is able to replace concrete and the other steel in a product that is far more sustainable than either of those and therefore much more zero carbon. So it was a terrific visit. I was inspired by the Limestone Coast and very pleased to see the two sides of my portfolio brought together so satisfyingly.
Member for Morialta.
Thank you, sir. My question is to the Minister for Education. Did the Minister discuss the letter in question with the Chief Executive of the Education Department or any member of the senior executive group in the Department for Education? Who was it that gave the instruction to education directors to instruct principals to distribute that letter?
Minister.
Thank you, Speaker, and thanks to the member again for that question. I'll have to go and get some answers. That's a pretty detailed question. The member obviously wants a very precise timeline here about exactly what took place. He knows full well how many things are going on in the Education Minister's office at any one time and in the department. There may have been a discussion about what communication was going out around the announcement about the $100 off the materials and services charge. I can't recall whether that was a conversation that I had. More likely it was probably a conversation that occurred between my—
Member for Chafee.
More likely, Mr Speaker, a conversation that would have occurred between my staff and the department. Happy to check that, but I know, as I said, and as I have said publicly in the past, Mr Speaker, the approach I am trying to take as the new Minister for Education is to be out on the front foot when there's good news and out on the front foot where there might be bad news. I think it's a very easy trap, Mr Speaker, to fall into as the Minister that you use the department always as a shield. I think my predecessor did a bit of that.
Member for Murray-Alta.
I think my predecessor did a fair bit of that. When there was good news and plaques to be cut, he was everywhere. When there was some bad news to front up to, he was nowhere.
Minister has the call.
When there was bad news in the portfolio, which happens from time to time, in such
Hartley.
a very large 9 to 5. Yes, I have heard the 9 to 5 one passed on to me by some departmental people. That's right, but it's important as Minister that you also front up when the news is bad news, and I have tried to make sure that I'm a Minister who does both those things, and I proudly had my name, as did the Premier, on this communication that we sent out to families to make sure that all South Australian families in the public education system, Mr Speaker, get the opportunity to save this $100 off their materials and services charge this year and next year as well.
The member for Murray-Alta and then the member for Playford.
Thank you, sir. My question is to the Minister for Education. Does the Minister consider that the letter is consistent with Section 6 of the Ministerial Code of Conduct, the requirement to maintain party political neutrality? And with leave, sir, and that of the House, I'd like to explain.
Leave is sought. Is leave granted? Yes, sir. The member.
Thank you, sir. The letter begins, "Dear parent caregiver," and I quote, "At the recent state election, we made a commitment that a Malinowskis Labor government would give South Australian families with school-aged children a $100 discount on their public schools materials and services charge for each child for the next 2 school years, 22 and 23. Bolded, at a time when costs of living pressures are being felt by many families, we're making sure we deliver on our commitment as quickly as possible."
The Minister. Minister has the call.
Thank you, Speaker. My understanding is that it is consistent and is not in breach with the particular clause that the member for Murray-Alta just read out. Happy to take some advice on that, but I think my answer is I don't think it contravenes the Code of Conduct in any way. I think the letter is pretty straight, to be perfectly honest. It really doesn't go into politics in any detail at all. It is a short letter which sets out in very easy to understand terms for all South Australian families who have children in the public education system what they need to do or what they don't need to do to make sure that they get access to this $100 off the materials and services charge this year and next year as well.
Well, the member for Murray-Alta, I see first. Member for Murray-Alta.
My question is to the Minister for Education. Is the Minister aware that the Code of Ethics for the South Australian public sector requires that, and I quote, "public sector employees must be detached from political influence"? And if so, why did the government instruct leaders in public education sites to distribute the letter in question?
Minister. Order. Order. Member for Chafee is warned. Order. Treasurer's call to order. Premier's call to order. Member for Badco. The Minister. Minister has the call.
Thank you, Speaker. I am aware of the provisions to which the member for Murray-Alta refers. As I said in my answer to his question before that question, I don't think the letter that was sent out by the Premier and myself about the $100 off the materials and services charge breaches that in any way. The member for Murray-Alta is possibly a bit more of an expert on these matters around communications that get sent out than I am. There was a bit of a near miss with the Ombudsman, if I recall. As I recall. So, I'll happily take his advice on these things.
Member for Chafee. Member for West Torrens. Order. Order. Has the Minister concluded his answer? Very well. Very well. Member for Playford, are you seeking the call? No. Very well. Member for Frome.
Thank you, Mr Speaker.